This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global MedTech community at mystrategist.com.
Welcome to the Market Pathways podcast. I'm Steve Levin, Editor-in-Chief of Market Pathways and MedTech Strategist. And in today's edition, we're going to share with you a panel discussion from our recent Dublin Innovation Summit, focusing on the current climate for changing the European Medical Device Regulation, MDR, and the In Vitro Diagnostics Regulation, IVDR. It's interesting because we have done sessions almost every year since MDR was enacted back in 2017 to track the progress of the regulation. And the one common theme in each of these sessions has been the need for substantive changes in the regulation, both from industry and from regulators. The only problem has been there really hasn't been an appetite to make these substantive changes, and the result has simply been an exercise in kicking the can down the road and extending various regulatory timelines rather than tackling the significant issues that emerged following the introduction of MDR. This year, things seem to have changed. The difference is that the regulators, and in Europe we're talking about the tripartite regulatory system that consists of the European Council, Parliament, and Commission, along with the 27 member states, really seem to have an appetite to tackle some of these significant issues that have been facing both industry and regulators regarding MDR, and that have caused the European MedTech market to really take a back seat to U.S., especially as the regulatory situation at FDA has improved over the past years. Companies are no longer looking to introduce products in Europe first, whereas previously the CE mark process was a clear-cut process, less expensive, less complex. Now things have flipped on their head, and the situation with FDA has gotten better, while the situation in Europe has gotten more complex, more expensive, and companies aren't comfortable with the risk of the unknown regulatory environment that exists in Europe. So what we're presenting today is a discussion with three leading experts on the MDR and the European regulatory system generally, who can offer their perspectives on what specific changes we're likely to see, how real those chances are, and when we might start to see some change and reversion back to a European system that's more welcoming to MedTech innovations, so that European clinicians and patients can get the early access to innovative technologies that they had previously under the old medical device directive. We hope you enjoy this conversation. This has kind of been a tradition in Dublin since MDR was passed. We have tried to keep everybody apprised of the state of play of MDR, and frankly, from year to year, it's been quite a dull and boring prospect, because it seems like the message has been the same every year, and that message is, yes, we know that there are problems with MDR, but we're not going to do anything other than kick the can down the road and extend timelines, and somehow the MedTech gods will figure these problems out. And obviously,
nothing has been figured out, and the problems continue. They've exacerbated. But the exciting thing for me this year is that, and again, I don't want to get too optimistic, and Cecile and Basil and Tom, you can kind of hold me back if I get too excited, is that it seems for the first time since 2017, there is actually the prospect on the horizon of actual change. And we're going to get into that. We want to talk kind of from a macro level about why attitudes appear to have changed among the powers that be. And we have to explain who the powers that be are, because it's been interesting to me. I mean, most Americans are clueless about the tripartite system of government, but I've often found even a lot of Europeans are not sure about what role the Parliament, the Council, the Commission play. So we're going to try to explain that to you so you walk away a little more educated about how the process works in a general way. And then I want to dig down and get into some of the specifics. And again, nothing's been done yet, so I don't want to get out too far ahead of our skis, but it seems like there's prospects here in a number of areas that I want to drill down into each of those. And I can't think of a better, more qualified group of leaders who just know MDR in and out. They've been following it, from their different positions in different aspects of the industry since it started. And so it's a really esteemed group, and I would encourage anybody in the audience who has questions about MDR, whether it's general or specific. And also, let me say, when I say MDR, I just got tired of saying MDR and IVDR, so I'm using it. And I know there are certain cases where diagnostics present some unique issues, so feel free to jump in and correct me, but I'm using MDR generically. But anybody has questions, just raise your hand or shout out. We really would like this to be interactive. So let me start out by introducing our panelists and letting them tell you a little bit about them. Cecile Vanderheiden is on my left, and Cecile's with the Action Law Firm, and I'm going to let you talk about Action and your area of expertise. But really, from a legal perspective, I have not found attorneys, barristers, solicitors, whatever you want to call yourselves, who are more knowledgeable about the regulatory process. And then let me just go down the line. Basil Acra, Team Acra, and Basil, I want you to talk about what Team Acra does, but also spend a little time on your background, because I'm going to ask you to wear a couple of different hats, given particularly your experience in notified bodies. So, and then Tom Melvin on the far left, and Tom also wears a couple of hats. He was an advisor to the EU and also to the Biomed Alliance. And Tom, I want you to talk about, for people who may not know what the Biomed Alliance was, but also Tom is a local academic who has been on the faculties at both Trinity and Galway. So ladies first. Cecile, why don't you tell us about Action and your background?
So Action Lawyers is a boutique law firm in the Netherlands, and we only work with life sciences companies. And I'm part of the regulatory team. I'm senior legal counsel by now. I've been here for 9 years. And my specific background is in healthcare law and every horizontal regulation surrounding MDR. So I have a lot of MDR knowledge, but I also like to bring in everything else that impacts devices.
And there is a lot of others, like we're going to get into the AI Act and the impact of the AI Act and MDR. So there are overlapping issues. Basil, talk about Team Acra, and then let's talk about, again, your background as well.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Basil Acra is my name. I work currently for Acra Team, which is a consultancy company supporting on regulatory, quality, and clinical. I have multiple hats, so I will not talk about all of them. This will be too much for today, but one of them as well, I'm actually, I support the European Commission in various activities regarding the MDR 2.0, so I was involved in part of their survey activities as well in the recent proposal in some of the justification that the Commission was looking for. Before that, I worked for 10 years for notified bodies, represented notified bodies in the various working groups, and co-writer of a lot of guidance documents that were outside, and where both of us were actually sitting in the same room and trying to write something which is useful for the industry. And happy to be with you here again.
Great, thanks. Good to have you. And Tom, talk a little bit, because again, there may be a lot of people who don't know what the Biomed Alliance is.
Yeah, no, thank you, Steve, and delighted to be here. So over the last year, I chaired the Regulatory Affairs Committee of a group called Biomed Alliance in Europe, and we bring together 35 European clinical associations, so groups like European Society of Cardiology, Orthopedics, lots of diagnostic societies, and at Biomed we grew over the last 10 years because we realized that there were lots of matters of shared interest where we weren't at the tables in Brussels at the right time. So we're now part of lots of the formal meetings for device regulators and their working groups, etc. Just myself, by way of background, I'm a medical doctor. I started out in law, but I then became a regulator in the Irish Authority and got to do lots of EU work, chairing the clinical working group. The last 4 years I've been in academia, so lots of research projects and education around regulatory affairs for devices, and at the Institute for Clinical Trials in Galway we do a lot of applied work to support new medical device developers get ready for their clinical studies in Ireland. So lots of different hats.
So let's start by kind of testing my initial premise, and feel free to tell me that I'm wrong, but do you share the view that up until this point, even though we've been revisiting this issue every year, that this year seems different in the sense that up until now there didn't seem like there was much of an appetite to make substantive changes that were so badly needed to MDR, and now it seems the tide has shifted. And again, I'm not trying to predict anything that's going to happen in the future, but it seems like there is renewed interest to actually try to do something substantive. Cecile, let me start with you.
I wouldn't necessarily say there wasn't appetite. I think it has been recognized for quite a while, also in Brussels, that change was needed. But first of all, we are still implementing MDR 1.0. So that took attention. At the same time, legislative processes, especially of the European Commission, take time. So from that perspective, it's not that nothing has happened. There has also been a lot of other legislation and guidance happening in the meantime, but this, of course, is way more significant with regard to impact on the system.
All right. Basil, what do you think?
So I agree with Cecile. So what happened actually in the past years were preparation years for what we have today. So in 2022, the European Commission started actually proactively, after listening to patients, to physicians complaining about the system being not functional, and getting the warning as well from Minister of Health from multiple member states saying something is going wrong. We don't want to be in 2024 without medical devices. We need to take action. So they started at that time to do a lot of survey, get the data, because the European Commission cannot take action without actual data-driven decision-making.
Right.
So based on that, they started doing the work, and we were involved in all of these activities over the past years. And now this led to, in 2024, to getting a political agenda for 2024 to 2029, which is saying one of the points is actually in medical device sector being resilient, being actually digital, being simplifying the system, supportive for innovation, and making sure that we have actually functional system afterwards. And if you look to this political agenda and you look to the MDR 2.0, you recognize the connection between the dots. So they are trying actually to reflect what they plan to do over the next years, and this is why there is a big push toward actually getting this simplification happening very quickly, and this is what is running at this moment.
So Tom, I want to get you to weigh in on that question, but kind of overlaying all this, and Basil, Cecile, feel free to chime in on this as well. We're talking about a number of different players that have roles in this process, and I think at the outset it's probably helpful to talk about, we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about the recent proposal by the European Commission that will then be acted upon by the Parliament and the Council. But maybe you can start, Tom, to just kind of, we don't have scorecards, so, to identify who the players are and what their roles are going forward and, what we're likely to see.
Yeah. Well, I guess on the first point about being proactive in supporting innovation. When we first introduced law in Europe in the early 1990s, that was driven by a desire to establish a single market. So it was to support industry, because before the directives you'd have to comply with a Belgian standard, a French standard, and there was partial, patchy rules that made it chaotic. So the directives had a useful effect in establishing the single market that we lost sight of to an extent of with the MDR, because we went from 20 articles in law to 120, and an enormous shift for regulatory practice in the sector. We're at an interesting point right now because, as you mentioned, the European Commission in Europe have the right of initiation for all new laws. So they get to write the draft and what they propose to change, and that gives them an enormous degree of power. What is now happening is that the other two legislative bodies, so the European Council and the European Parliament, are both now active on this brief. We don't know for sure when this legislative process will be finished. Some people would estimate the end of the year, and some people think that's optimistic. But it could be something along that kind of timeline. And over the next couple of months, what will start to become clearer are what are the areas within this proposal that will be negotiated. Everything now becomes a negotiation. So they're looking at this not article or line by line, but they're looking at it in terms of clusters. And we'll start to understand a little bit more about that in the next 2 or 3 months as the positions of the different institutions come out, and they'll start to form what they call a trialogue, where they start to negotiate around these clusters and these points. So right now, officially, we don't know exactly what the pivotal points will be for debate, but we will know in about 2 or 3 months.
And I want Basil and Cecilia to chime in, but my recollection is that it took 5 years from when MDR was in. Is that accurate? And I'm not saying it's going to take 5 years now.
No, it will not, because at that time we had a scandal which actually drove a full revision of legislation, and they were actually preparing since many years actually.
Are you talking about PIP or the metal on metal? Okay.
Yeah, so the idea was actually, so in 2008 they started working on a European regulation for medical device sector and IVD. In 2011, when the scandal happened, there was an accelerator. We need to be faster. So they came with a proposal, and they had to put something on the table immediately. And they put the proposal, and this is actually a huge change from actually a short directive, multiple directive toward regulation. And it took them actually many years till we got an alignment. Now it's a different situation. Now we have actually the regulation, and we are actually looking into how we can make it much more patient-centric, much more healthcare system-centric, gaining again the innovation to European market, because Europe became actually not anymore #1 market for most of the industry. Even European are trying to target actually other jurisdictions first. So Europe is in a rush now, considering geopolitical situation, to make sure that we have a system which is functioning. So it's not actually complete rediscussion about the rules and the elements which we have in the MDR and IVDR, but focus on the questions that came from a lot of activities over the past years. That's why I mentioned 2022, where they started the activities, and they got the feedback from the market saying, we need to get an innovative supportive system. We need to get actually simplification. We need to take care of our small and mid-sized companies. So all of these elements are now considered in this proposal, and what they are trying to address is actually what the European Commissioner said. He's saying we are moving toward the smart regulation, and I agree. And he said as well, we are not trying to reduce the level of safety. Safety will be capped, and this is very important. But we need to be smarter, because we went from an old system to an administrative system, and the system became actually a paperwork. So manufacturers are actually spending hours and a huge amount of resources writing papers which are not adding value to the patients. And this is where the new proposal is looking into it, and I think this process, and I agree with Tom, going to take us some time, but it will not be 5 years, potentially 1 year or 1.5 years max. Then we're going to have it in place.
I'm glad that both of you have brought up the point about innovation. Obviously, innovation is what this conference is all about, and for many companies in the audience, they're very used to the old model under the Medical Device Directive, the MDD, where you would go to Europe first, you could get CE mark relatively quickly, transparently. You knew the process. It was, you could do it relatively inexpensively, accumulate early clinical data, maybe some early revenue, and then go back to the U.S. And now we've seen that model flip on its head, and combined with, I have to also say, there have been improvements at FDA. So FDA had been, much harder to get through. Now that has improved, and then the complexity surrounding MDR has flipped the model. So do you share the view that MDR has had a deleterious effect on innovation in Europe in terms of, because I mean, I hear even investors, VCs are saying, well, we want our companies to look at the US first now rather than look to Europe. Are you all hearing the same thing from the companies you work with?
Definitely. I think what we do notice these days is companies are tired of what's happening in Europe. It's not just MDR, it's everything else as well. And I think it's important to stress, especially for companies that are currently looking at where am I going to market first, and investors, that it's not just MDR that we're revising. This is part of a way broader innovation discussion in Europe where we are simplifying a lot of legislation. We see movements with regard to the AI Act, we see movements with regard to GDPR, and it will not resolve everything, but it is going to be a wider simplification that makes the system more understandable.
Hey, have you heard of Market Pathways? Market Pathways provides the most in-depth analysis you'll find of the changes happening in medical device regulation and reimbursement every day. They address the complexity in regulatory affairs and beyond by helping you digest and contextualize technical topics like Medicare and MDR. Visit mystrategist.com/trial today to start your free 5-day trial to Market Pathways. Again, that's mystrategist.com/trial for 5 days of online access.
And do you see a consensus emerging among, because let's face it, sometimes Americans make the mistake of looking at the EU as a monolithic entity. And I know a single market is the goal and achieved great progress in doing that. There are still 27 different nations to wrestle with. But do you think there is a consensus among the member states about the need to revise and improve MDR, and is it more driven by the countries like France and Germany that are leaders in the medical device, as opposed to, let's say, Spain and Greece that may not have large MedTech industries?
So there is in Europe, you are mentioning something very important. We have 27 member states, 27 mentalities. They agree, all of them, we need to rework on the MDR and IVDR. Do they agree on all the measures? I would say always no, because every single member state, they have their preference and preferred processes, what they would like to have, what they don't want to have. But at least they are in alignment that we need to change what we are currently actually facing, because at the end, they are getting the complaints from the patient and from the manufacturers to say, we need to actually do something. So they listen to the market. But now we need to get them all together, and this is why Parliament and Council will be actually an important point. Everyone is lobbying now to make sure that actually they are raising their voice. And what we essentially need is actually we want to get devices on time to the market. And one of the topics that we didn't mention before, you said predictability. Innovation, why would you bring an innovation to a market? Because you need to understand, do I understand the market? Do I understand what I have to fulfill? An investor, and I'm an investor as well, I would not invest in something which is a black box. Right. So I need to know what's going to be the output and when. And Europe became actually a black box because notified bodies were not allowed to talk to you. Right. Regulation was actually like one of the colleagues of Cecile will always say lasagna.
It's still a spaghetti.
Spaghetti or lasagna, whatever it is. It's actually a confusion of multiple legislation which you cannot actually make them reasonable, and people are confused. So people will go to a market like FDA where you can have a pre-submission meeting, you can talk to the regulators, you know what are the requirements very clearly. And this is why Europe became unpredictable. Now, the new proposal gonna include as well timeline for notified bodies, standard timelines, which is saying this is how long it will take. And there will be a clock stop. This measure is also even earlier potentially, because we have an implementation act which is ongoing toward changing the notified body working behavior. And this is the first time going into the medical device sector to get rules defining fees, defining actually timelines for notified bodies, which can lead to higher transparency and predictability.
So I'm glad you brought up notified bodies, because that's a big area that we wanted to talk about from a number of perspectives. And again, just to kind of provide a little context for people who may not be as familiar, when MDR was initially adopted, I think it's fair to say that notified bodies were one of the main initial bottlenecks in the process. I mean, we went from having 85, give or take, notified bodies pre-MDR, and then they had to be recertified. I think now for devices, we're up to 50-some
52
notified bodies. But there was that initial period where they were getting recertified, and that was a real bottleneck. Now, what we hear is that there's been a lot of hiring, and that there are now sufficient resources. You could argue we never needed 85 notified bodies to start with, and that 50 are sufficient, especially if they have sufficient resources. In fact, what I hear from some people are that they hired too many people, and now the notified bodies are laying people off because they don't have enough work. But be that as it may, notified bodies, through their organization, Team MB, have also raised concerns about some of these proposals. So I want to get each of you to weigh in on the current state of the state of notified bodies under MDR currently, and what is the opposition that notified bodies have to some of these proposals. And Tom, you want to start, and we'll go to
Notified bodies are facing a difficult time. They reported in December that they have over 6,000 staff across the Team MB members, which would be about 45 out of the overall number. And within that, there's about 1,000 clinical assessors. When the revision proposal was published, I think some notified bodies already started looking at headcount. So that has happened to an extent. My own suspicion would be that if we relook next December at the figures in notified bodies, it will start to shrink, and will probably shrink more in the following year. When we think of some of the revision changes, so getting rid of reassessments or what's called recertification, that will probably knock out, certain product teams within notified bodies. So when you think of translational development and bringing a new product to market, finding your notified body and ensuring they have capacity over the next 2 years will be important, because that could get a little bit dynamic. Just on the previous point about innovation and MDR and all of the discourse around MDR being an innovation killer, I think that innovation is still happening in Europe, for sure. Think about percutaneous mitral valve interventions. FDA have 5 of them approved through pre-market authorization. We have 15 in Europe. So it's still happening, it's still being introduced, but the sentiment has certainly changed. And I think especially for people coming from the United States, they hear bad things about MDR and think, well, we won't even consider Europe as a site for studies. It's important to remember that lots of things didn't change all that much. So your pre-market trials and things like that, that's essentially the way it was. And Europe is trying to get more strategic around how it supports new product introduction. There's all kinds of things like a combined project for combination products, things they're doing for multi-state studies where you just have one assessment even though it's going to multiple countries. These will take some time, but they are trying to make it more friendly for, especially in pre-market and evidence generation. There are some good things happening, but the sentiment sometimes doesn't suggest that.
Basil, again, as I mentioned earlier, you have hands-on experience for years working with notified bodies. Talk a little bit about your take on the current lay of the land, and then get into what the notified bodies' concerns are with these proposals.
So let me get back to where you started the question. They were the bottleneck at the beginning. So notified bodies are, on themselves, they are service providers. They are independent, impartial service providers. When the NDR started, and I was leading one of actually big notified bodies at that time, when we wanted to get actually ready, the biggest bottleneck was the member states and the auditing done by actually the joint assessment team to get notified bodies ready. So notified bodies were actually looking toward having a smooth process. It took them actually 18 months to 2 years to get designated, because the system wasn't ready even for that. So because they couldn't even apply before 6 months after publication of the regulation, because the member state and the joint assessment team need to be actually ready for that. And then when the audit happened, and I can tell you, the 2 initial notified bodies, SWIFT and BSI, they were facing big challenges because they didn't come in to make the system running. They came in like policemen trying to tell you why you are bad. And this led actually to a lot of delays, a lot of complexity. And this is what led to the system being very slow at the very beginning. You recognize actually the past 3-4 years, this is where the ramp up of number of notified bodies happens, because suddenly they recognize we need to lower the bar. But at the beginning they came in, they wanted to actually don't designate you. They didn't want you to be actually designated. They tried to find any reason, any typo to say you are wrong. So, and in my recommendation at that time as representative of notified bodies to the European Commission at that time, it's like allow every notified body available today to be designated immediately, and you check that during surveillance. Then we're going to have a running system. And then they said, no, we need to undergo a designation from scratch again. And this is actually the biggest bottleneck. So it's not just the notified bodies. We need to keep in mind the member states are playing an important role. And over the course of the years, the member states were actually adding more expectation, which were the taste of the member state because they had the power to ensure actually that the notified bodies are operating in line with their expectation. And this led to actually more complexity for the manufacturers because if you get from top down expectation, this is transferred to the manufacturer, which leads to actually delays. Why the notified bodies are concerned? There are multiple layers connected to it. The first layer is actually, they got all of these rules with the justification, we want to improve safety and we want to increase better, we want to create a system which is leading to better performing devices while not actually damaging innovation. Innovation damages happen, but not systematically. They happen because of the fear and panic of some companies going somewhere else. But the safety increase, in my view, didn't happen because what is the safety increase if you are actually just getting the same device with more documentation? Safety increase means for me if we got rid of a lot of devices which weren't safe on the market. But what we are getting rid of are devices where manufacturers are saying, I'm not willing to pay anymore and invest on those devices to remediate them toward legislation.
And just to clarify, what you found, particularly among large manufacturers, where you had a lot of, I would say, niche products that the manufacturer decided it's not worth spending the money to build the additional clinical data and whatever we needed to get it recertified. So they just, basically,
This is what happened, actually. Most of the big companies said 20% or 30% of my portfolio I will not bring to MDR. But they are still on the market, for example, in the US or other jurisdictions. They just didn't want to remediate for MDR. So reality is we didn't improve safety by the MDR by doing that. The only piece which improved safety, in my point of view, is actually what we wrote at that time, the MEDEF, to say to manufacturer, you need to do better clinical evaluation. And those manufacturers who recognize I cannot write it well, they actually by themselves decided to actually get rid of their device because they didn't have the evidence. Now, notified bodies are using that as a justification to say the new proposal will put patient under a safety risk. But is it reality? I need numbers. I don't see the numbers yet.
And are you talking about because they're going to limit kind of the post-market surveillance authority? Is that the crux of it?
This is one piece, and also recertification and also sampling, because this is like the proposal is saying you don't need to sample devices, you do focus auditing, you don't need to do actually regular audit, you can justify coming every second year. But if you look to the reality, the holistic story, it's not actually leading to a safety issue, because notified bodies can still have actually control. And what I remember everyone all the time, manufacturers are liable for their devices. So they have to actually ensure continuous safety and well-performing devices. So notified bodies are not actually responsible for the device safety. It's the manufacturer's responsibility. They are responsible to check if the manufacturer is meeting those obligations. And we still have in the European system market surveillance authorities who are going to monitor the market. And in case they recognize a signal, then they can take actions. And I think this is actually the current situation. This is the one fault. The other fault which you need to consider is what you said before. I was asked to hire too many resources over the past 9 years. Now, notified bodies hired every year 18 to 20% more resources just to address the MDR and IVDR requirement as service provider. And then you tell them now after 9 years, it was a joke, fire all your people because we are going to reduce your business by 80%. This is truly actually unacceptable because this is unfair treatment of an organization who built the resources to address market needs and then afterwards getting actually blamed for being the bottleneck. They are not the only problem. The problem is actually the legislation wasn't written in a way that allows them as notified bodies to do their job in the right way.
Right, and I think it's, again, when we talk about issues with notified bodies, I think everybody would agree that really the overall issue is the poor implementation that started initially. But I'm glad you brought up the 5-year recertification program that MDR required. Am I right in sensing that there's a difference of perspective between what industry wants in terms of getting rid of the 5-year recertification and what the notified bodies want. I don't know, Cecilia, you want to weigh in on that?
Oh, I think there's definitely a big
And
divide.
why do the notified bodies want to preserve the 5-year certification?
If I'm being cynical, it is a lot of work where you can employ people and bring in money for your notified body business.
We call it just honesty, not cynicism.
Fair enough. I think if we look at the system, there are a lot of devices and a lot of companies where this would strictly not be necessary. That isn't to say that there wouldn't be situations where there might be an issue, but that issue needs, as Basil said, to be picked up either by the company themselves, and if they don't take action, then it needs to be the competent authority who steps in. I think what we should focus on, instead of looking at, the poor notified bodies, and I understand why they're bringing these arguments forward, but there are some big improvements if you're in the market. There will be expert panels. You can have actually a competent authority weigh in on a decision by a notified body, meaning that you don't have to necessarily take your notified body to court, which is a lot better for your relationship.
And I apologize for interrupting, but I think that's an important point, and again, that may be lost a little on the audience because we don't refer to expert panels in the same way with regard to FDA. But the role of, for example, in the FDA, there's a process called pre-submission meetings where you can meet with reviewers, during the application process and get an idea of what their expectations are. And I'm oversimplifying, but in Europe, there was kind of a wall, and you weren't really allowed to meet with the equivalent of, reviewers. And that is changing, or the suggestion that might change under the new MDR proposal.
Maybe just on that point, you're completely right, Steve. When I talk to new product developers through an academic setting, they often haven't picked their territory of market introduction. But when you talk them through, these are the US options and these are the European options, they often naturally go towards the US because simply the pathway is clearer. And I think if we want to truly support innovation in Europe, exactly like you're saying, we need something equivalent to a pre-sub type clarity that can be bought as early as you can bring it, where they'll bring their clinical development strategy and someone from a regulatory perspective says, that's reasonable, or we'd prefer this kind of endpoint or this kind of study duration. That strengthens pitches and strengthens funding, and that really helps translational development. There will be some changes in Europe to help with that. Right now, you can get advice from the EMA expert panels, but only for the high-risk devices.
The EMA being the European Medicines Agency.
Exactly, and you can get some advice from national authorities about your studies, but they won't tell you that study design should be good for CE marking because they restrict themselves. So 2/3 of competent authorities, the national regulators in Europe will give advice, but it's never the kind of pre-sub type advice we are getting into actual clinical outcomes or protocol aspects. So I think that's absolutely vital. And if we can figure out how to build that better, that's how you'd really support the new products being introduced.
I'm glad you mentioned the EMA because in our last few minutes, I'd like to talk about structure. And again, this is something that a lot of American companies take for granted because we've got, the FDA and then the device group CDRH kind of built in. But there's a debate going on as part of this overall MDR revision process as to how to best regulate medical devices in Europe. And there are a couple different models. You mentioned the EMA, Tom, and I think there's some concern, and this I think always comes up, from MedTech suffering from being the poor redheaded little sister of biopharma and biotech, so that anytime you put us together with biopharma and biotech in the same agency, we're just going to kind of get subsumed by them and lost in the sauce, so to speak. Another option that I've heard discussed stems from the recent passage of the AI Act, where you created a central AI office, and could you create a central office for medical devices? And this also, of course, brings in, and I think it's worth talking about, the impact of, as more devices are employing AI, the overlap of AI Act and MDR, and which carries the day. So let me start, Basil, with you, and then Cecile, talk a little bit about this whole issue of structure. What do you think would be the best regulatory structure to move ahead with? And again, address the issue of AI and MDR overlap?
Yeah, the problem that you have in Europe, we don't have actually one single place who's carrying the hat for every requirement. So, and the problem is that the European legislator wanted to use what they had as elements and give everyone responsibility. Now they gave them pieces of responsibility, like Tom was mentioning, and no one feels responsible for the other part. Now with the move of MDR and IVDR, they are actually creating dispute principle. They are creating actually abilities to connect the dots that you can speak to them. But you still have all these parties, and everyone has his own responsibility. So we still don't have this one decision maker. And this is a complexity which we have in the MedTech sector. And this is problematic on the long term. Now we see much more involvement of EMA in a lot of activities based on their expertise in running such a process. But will Europe target in 20 years moving to a central coordinated system? We don't know, but we see already some steps happening towards such a system, because if we see how much EMA is taking over, it might be a long-term direction that potentially we have a system like US FDA, which is actually delegating some of activities to third parties like notified bodies and taking the major responsibility for critical devices, because Europe has one target: we need to be resilient for geopolitical crisis, for pandemic situation, and so on. And you cannot be resilient if you are actually fragmented as a system. So you need to make sure that you have a better system long term. Let's see what's gonna happen. Perhaps I will be retired, I will not look to it anymore. But I will look to it with a smile and say, thanks God we fixed our problems in Europe.
But what about, as long as you're talking about that, what about AI?
I mean, AI is another topic, another layer. Now they are doing AI, they have the office suggestion. But AI is also, again, notified bodies, authorities, commission. It's this fragmentation, which I just mentioned, is the same. It's not really different. Now what they are trying to facilitate and make it easier, they are trying to avoid referring to legislation in the legislation by overruling the rules. So they are trying to clean up the rules. So for example, they took actually liability requirement out of the MDR, but they are now in the liability directive. So you need to look to them there. Some of the overmatched between AI Act and MDR, they are trying to make it simple that you have just one application to get both of them for medical device sector. But is it simple? No. You need an AI to understand what they are doing.
And now you all know why I love being in law.
Right. So I want you to weigh in, because I think, it's important for companies in the audience that are listening, because more of them are obviously employing AI, and to know that they've got to kind of juggle not just MDR, but the AI Act and other acts as well.
Yeah, so the interesting thing with AI is that we have two proposals which weren't quite aligned, and the member states aren't very happy with either of them. On one side, so medical devices, most of that contain AI systems or AI as safety components, are mainly high-risk AI systems, safe for Class 1 or Class A. We now are trying to move the medical device AI in the MDR proposal outside of the high-risk regime. But then we give the option to the European Commission to re-implement parts of that regime in delegated acts and implementation acts to apply them to medical devices anyhow. So you get a bit of legal uncertainty here, but you know what to look at and what aspects are already there, and that's what they need to choose from. At the same time, we also have a proposal to simplify the AI Act. So you need to look at that at the same time. Looking at that proposal, you will also want to look at the proposals for GDPR and training AI, which are also being addressed. So we are trying to simplify it. As Basil said, we're going towards a system where you don't need to have two notified body assessments for your two legislative frameworks. Hopefully, we're not even stuck with the AI Act there at all for medical devices. But in the end, there's more legislation to look at. And don't think that the US is the holy grail, because in the US you also need to deal with HIPAA in addition to all your devices legislation. That's the thing with legislation. You can't cover everything in one law. Different topics, different laws.
Do you have a perspective on centralization of authority, whether it should rest with EMA, should they create a separate office, or some hybrid office? I
think I would like the centralization from a from an organizational perspective, from the perspective of legal certainty, from not having to deal with different legal systems that regulate notified bodies differently, meaning that they have different positions on the law and making it very difficult to fight the decisions. At the same time, I would hate for us to start over again in Europe, having to go with the EMA learning everything that the notified bodies already learned. So in the ideal situation, yes, centralization, but in a controlled manner.
Okay. So in our last couple of minutes, I didn't ask any of you to bring crystal balls, although Cecile's colleague, Eric Volbrecht, for those of you who may know him, he does a lot of work with the medical device, has a magic 8-ball that he uses. So if you ask him a question, he'll pull out the magic 8-ball. So just kind of hypothetically, if you had an 8-ball or a crystal ball, talk about what you think the immediate future is. And again, not asking you to predict specific time frames, but how do you think this is going to evolve, and when will product companies start seeing some of these changes that we're talking about? And which ones do you think are likely to emerge earlier? For example, I mean, there's some proposal, separate proposal from the Commission that doesn't require legislative action, and that can be finalized immediately to create stricter timelines and requirements for notified bodies. So that might operate on a different path than some of these larger changes we're talking about that require legislative action. So what do you think in the near future, and what do you think will take longer? Tom, why don't you start?
Well, we mentioned the legislative timeline already. Once that's finalized, either late this year or next year, it'll be into implementation. So a lot of these things could be implemented very quickly. What we will be facing once the legal debate is finished is the implementation valley of death, from law changing and outcomes changing. And there's a lot of difficult parts that we'll have to work on. So I think for regulators in Europe, there'll be two main things. They'll have to go back to the 100 or so guidance documents and figure out what of them need to be changed. A number of them will. On the other side, we'll have organizations with new mandates. So we mentioned the European Medicines Agency. As written in the proposal, they could have responsibilities for clinical studies, vigilance, and what they call post-market surveillance, but we don't understand what that will look like in practice. So that will really come down to the policy debates that will be happening now, and then how they'll start their implementation work. So there'll be a lot of change coming over the next 2 years, and some of that change will go even beyond that to give the practical detail through guidance or specifications or however it will be, to try and bring that clarity. And I hope in the meantime that we realize that by bringing early clinical clarity, especially to new product developers, that's one of the most important things we can do to support innovation. But we'll have to see how implementation goes.
And let me ask you, and then I'll have Basil and Cecile weigh in. The spirit of my question is really, when do you think we can expect Europe to return not to the kind of status quo of the MDD, but at least a level of certainty that can encourage companies to bring innovative technologies to patients and clinicians in Europe earlier than is occurring now?
So we are currently cleaning our house from actually a heritage of MDD moving to MDR. Right. So currently we are still actually in this process. We have, in 2022, the Commission asked how many applications do we have and how far are we? We had 22,000 applications at that time and 2,000 certificates issued for the MDR. Today in 2026, we have 35,000 applications because the number is growing and the number of issued certificates is 17,500. So 50% now. At that time, it was 10%. And we are still running, and the time is ticking. 2027, 2028 are the deadlines. So we need to get, first of all, rid of all of these old products that we are changing, moving to MDR. So we need to do the work to be done. When it is done, then we can talk about a better future, because if we don't have that work done and we are carrying this actually work with us still on the process, then we will have to wait for many years. My personal wish and my personal vision is actually that in 2030 the system is settled again. Because currently we started seeing, I supported manufacturer getting certificate in 3 months. we could do it in Europe. It's all about planning. It's all about being ready on time and understanding the obligation. So it's possible. It's, again, Europe is becoming more predictable. 3 months, 6 months certification are happening. Now we need to plan it, we need to be ready, but the problem which we have, we are still making people busy with old work, which is unnecessary. And the proposal include, for example, grandfathering clause for orphan devices. And if we get that, this is a huge. Well-established technologies are getting actually facilitated to reduce actually the obligation on them. And now it's all our commitment, industry, notified bodies, authorities to say, let's make it happen, and it's doable. And now the question, shall we carry it now till 2040, 2060, or we make sure that the next 2 years, it will be actually the move toward a better European system?
And I'm glad you mentioned the orphan device pathway, and I also want to mention that along with that, there was another pilot program kind of similar to the breakthrough program in the U.S. that again seems to be one that's going to be implemented as well. So there's progress.
Yeah. The breakthrough is currently running. So the Q2 of this year is already in the pilot phase. So before the proposal will be adopted, it's starting now for cardiovascular devices. If you are a cardiovascular innovator, you have an opportunity to apply. One application per manufacturer for a pilot phase. And we have also with the proposal a sandbox for emerging technologies. Right. So there is a lot of positive things inside the legislation. This is why my hope, we shouldn't wait too long. We need to get it done. And latest by 2030, we should talk about actually how attractive Europe is at this moment and why manufacturer should just come to Europe first.
Cecile, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I think we are attractive, and we're getting more attractive.
You mean me?
Of course, Russell. I would never say anything else. No, but we are improving this system, and we are trying to move it forward. And member states may have some feelings about that, and some things might change. But I think we have a fairly good feeling of where we all want to move, namely more products to market in a faster timeline. You see other proposals by the European Commission, such as the Biotech Act, which also impacts mainly IVDs, in addition to pharma, which allows for more streamlining, for example, with combination medicines products. So I think if we are serious in Europe, then 2030, while it may be realistic, should not be our aim, but it should be sooner.
Great. Well, I appreciate you ending on a positive note because, as you know, I mean, companies hate uncertainty. So, providing a timeline that, seems possible is very, very helpful. The one thing that I can assure everyone is that we will be back here next year at the Shelburne in Dublin, and hopefully with this same, panel, and hopefully we're talking about progress that has been made over the course of the next year. So really appreciate your insights. Let's thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion. Thanks so much.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.